Okay. So I am Isabel de la Hoya. I am a cook out in Callantyre. I am currently the head of the Callantyre's Cooks Guild, although we haven't really existed for about a year since we haven't had events. Um, but one of the things that I study is the reasoning why people in medieval Europe ate the way they did. So if you understand things like the laws or the ecology or the religious laws revolving around dietary and dietary choices, you can better replicate a medieval dish that isn't necessarily found in an extant cookbook. Um, Medieval cookbooks were medieval brag books. They are written for the nobility, for the rich, for their servants, for their wives, for their children. And what most people ate day in, day out was not in a cookbook. So if you were only reproducing foods found in extant cookbooks, we are skipping most of our culinary history. So there are a number of factors that determine what the medieval European ate. And I'm going to say, for the purposes of this lecture and for my research, medieval Europe is Western. I mostly focus on Western Europe, and I'm mostly focused on like the 11th, 12th to 16th centuries, the High Middle Ages and the Late Middle Ages. So the things that defined what you ate was your socioeconomic status. And for most of this history, your social status and your economic status is pretty much the same. There is some upward mobility, but not as much as there are in later periods. Natural seasonal changes, the natural world and what is available when very much shapes what you can eat. Religious restrictions were huge in the medieval European diet. We do pretty much only talk about Catholic and then later Reformation, after the Reformation, the Protestant kind of religious restrictions. That is the majority of who was represented in popular medieval Europe, but obviously that's not the only religion, and those are the only restrictions. Legal factors. There were laws about what you could and couldn't eat. Believe it or not, there are sumptuary laws about what you can and can't eat based on your class and other things. Um, and then there are just simply foods that are not yet available in Europe. With throwing out the caveat is when I go through that list of foods, as we move closer to the very end of periods, some of these foods become available to the very top of society. You know, there may be evidence that Queen Elizabeth ate a sweet potato, but Timmy the farmer most certainly didn't. And then we're also going to talk about their ideas about the natural world and how scientific theory worked, and how the humoral theory would shape what people ate. So we really need to start with the medieval house. The medieval house, people lived in a very small house with a central hearth. And I'm going to fast forward here to kind of show you what the inside of the typical medieval peasant's house would be. This wouldn't necessarily be someone who lived in a townhouse or in something like that, because even if you lived in a townhouse, you may not even have a cooking fire. But you had very simple cook fire. You hung food from the rafters. You may have had a grain ark, which is what we see in this background here, is where people kept their grain. You could flip over the lid, and you can make your dough and things of that nature. You can see garlic hanging from the rafters because it kept it out of the animals and the rats and things of that nature. Um, and you can clearly see they had their chickens in the house with them, and this is extremely typical. So if you were the average person, you maybe had one or two cook pots and a central hearth. Now, if you were higher class, if you had more money, if you were the lord in a manor, your manor would have a kitchen. You would have a more complex kitchen setup, and therefore more complex meals could be made. And also, if you remember, you didn't see an oven in that simple house. So most people had to bring things either to a village oven or to a manorial oven, or kind of tip over a pot and put some coals around it. I've actually cooked a 16th century cake before in two little clay earthenware pots with coals around it. I mean, not great, but it happened. So people could possibly make bread, or they'd make flat bread or unleavened bread, and they had a cook pot. So we're really talking bread and pottage fed most people through most of human history. And pottage, of course, is just anything you put in a cook pot is pottage. You would have to pay to have your grain ground. Of course, there are periods of time where people had quorns, which was the hand grinders, where we get the daily grind from. But when we're talking about an area of several hundred years and many different countries, laws changed. And during certain types of history, if your town had a mill, you had to use that mill, and you had to pay to use that mill. And if you were caught with your quern, with your own grindstone, there could be fees or penalties, or they would break it. Again, you would have to pay to bake your bread. If you didn't have access to an oven, you had to go to a commercial bakery. That's where we get the patty cake, baker's man kind of rhyme, the market with the T. That's because when they fired up one of those big old bread ovens, they're not just cooking your bread. They're not just cooking your food. They're cooking many, many others. And so you would mark which dough was yours. That was a legit thing that happened. If you lived in a manorial or a monastic land, you would have to pay to use the monastery's bread oven, or the monastery's oven for your pies and stuff like that. So yes, people ate bread, but pottage was cheaper to make often because you could put whatever vegetation you had, whatever meat you had, if you had meat, and if you're allowed to have it. And you can put whatever pulses, which are things like lentils and things of that nature, and peas. You could put anything in the pot, and you didn't have to pay to have it grind, and you didn't have to pay to bake it. So pottage was extremely important for thousands and thousands of years. And honestly, when it's really cold and nasty outside, what's better than a bowl of hot stew when you come inside? Now today, if I go to the grocery store, the most expensive fancy bread I can find is probably this wonderful, rich, brown, multigrain bread that has whole wheat. And even I like the bread that has like the bits of little nuts and seeds and stuff inside of it. And the cheap bread is the bunny bread, the white bread that's been bleached and all that stuff. That is not the case in medieval Europe. The poor ate brown bread, which wasn't necessarily even wheat or all wheat. It definitely had things like rye in it, it had barley in it, it had oats in it, it could have peas in it. You just never know what was in it. I mean, you could know what was in it when there was adulteration laws, but it wasn't necessarily just wheat bread. And the rich ate white bread. And when I say white bread, I do not mean the bleached white bread we get today. White bread was made by basically sifting the flour through a progressively small kind of sifty things. They would put it through cheesecloth, they'd put it through even fine linen cloth. It is a lot of work. I have done it. If you do this, do not breathe in the flour dust. That's a 0 out of 10. I do not recommend. I thought I was dying. But it's extremely hard work, and you get an extremely low amount of pure white flour for the amount of grain you started with. So white bread was incredibly expensive, and there were different grades of white bread. You had the first sifting, you had the second sifting, you had the third sifting, and there were different names for it and things of that nature. But pretty much just the rich ate the white bread, and they didn't even always eat it every single day. But our white bread would probably be what we would call white wheat, or their white bread is what we probably call white wheat. Um, Dairy was extremely important. Um, but because of, they didn't have refrigerators like we do, um, it had to be preserved. And the way you preserve dairy is by making cheese, by making butter. Um, Cheese was called sometimes white meat. It was an invaluable source of animal fats that when you fermented it or preserved it and salted it, it would stay fresh. And that was an incredibly important source of calories and nutrition. Fresh fish could also be very expensive. And it's really interesting thinking about, especially in England, where they have all these waterways and they're on the water. You would think that fresh fish would be everywhere on all levels of society, but they really weren't. Fresh fish was mostly eaten by the gentry and the nobility, and the monasteries. Um, Most peasants could afford the salted fish, and a lot of people ate eel. Eel or lampreys was everywhere, especially in England's riverways, and people would generally eat them. And they were considered more lower class, but of course, certain nobility and certain kings, especially the one that died, it was one of the Henrys, died from eating lamprey. Um, Meat was very expensive. Um, Somehow in popular culture there's this idea that in medieval Europe people only ate meat. Part of that might come from, in a certain point in history, meat just meant food. Have you had your meat? Have you eaten? um, but people did not have a meat heavy diet like Western American or westernized Europeans and Americans have today. It was very expensive. Of course, the richer you were, the more meat you could have. If you were a farmer, if you had livestock, if you had poultry, yes, you owned animals, then yes, you could butcher them. But your ox, you're going to want your ox to plow your fields. If you cook and eat that ox, you've got no one to work your plow next year. So you wouldn't cook him until the end of his life. If you have poultry, if you have ducks, if you have geese, if you have chickens, that is an extremely valuable source of eggs. And when you kill and you eat that duck, she can't lay any more eggs. So you don't eat these animals until the end of their life. So your animal, your livestock, they're so much more valuable as a beast of burden. They're so much more valuable as a dairy cow and giving you milk, giving you eggs, things of that nature. Pigs, however, um, they weren't necessarily like, you don't put a plow up to a pig or anything like that. You could use pigs to clear land, and you can fatten your pigs on land, and they eat like all the berries, and not the berries, but the nuts and stuff that fall before you go and clear it out. But pigs could live on scraps. They breed very quickly, and they could also be raised in towns. And for those people who eat pork, pork is delicious, in my opinion. But it's a great source of nutrition that can be very quickly turned from raw, from an apple core to bacon. Like pigs are magic. They turn trash into bacon. If you lived in a city or a town, there would be food stalls. There would be pot shops, which I got to stop calling them that because that sounds like something totally different. But you would go in and you'd buy a bowl of soup. You'd buy a crust of bread. There were street food vendors. They're in the idea that restaurants, the idea that people couldn't buy food from anywhere at home is just, there have been restaurants since the days of Pompeii. But if you lived in a city, if you lived in a town, you might not have access to a kitchen. You know, if you're in a wooden tenement, your landlord doesn't want you starting a fire in your living room, especially if your house is made out of wood. So you got to pop down the street and buy your food from someone. So they were very common. And then we've got to the inside of the typical medieval house. Here's an example of a portable oven. So in these towns and in cities, sometimes the oven would come to you, or there'd be an oven in one area of the city during one day, or there'd be an oven the next day, or they take these ovens from different little towns. I love this illustration. I've used it so many times. But you know, you have them pulling pies out. You've got, which I'm really just going to say are soft pretzels. I can't imagine what else they are. Um, but it's a lovely illustration, and it shows kind of how those cob ovens were made, and how they're just kind of pulled around, and people would have access to these ovens. So on the other end society, we've got a house in a manor. We've got the house of the rich, and of course this is also you know, very end of the 16th century as well. I think it's actually 1601, so the very beginning of the 17th century. But it's not like kitchens suddenly changed in the 30 years from the late 16th century to the early 17th century. But you see, they have access to so much more. Not pictured as a bakehouse. The bakehouse might have actually been in a different room or a different part of the kitchen complex completely. But they would also have bread ovens and things of that nature. And you have the spit, and you've got the cook pots, and I really think this was running water just based on this tap, which of course running water is something people had in antiquity. Of course, people didn't always have running water. Technology ebbs and flows in the Middle Ages, but it was certainly something that people knew about and people had access to at certain levels of society and in certain times. So you can clearly get a much more complex meal out of this kitchen than you can this kitchen. Any questions so far about kind of socioeconomic? So the seasons would change, and as the seasons change, your access to food changes. The produce that be grown in the fall is different from the produce that's grown in the summer. Now, some of this produce could be preserved. They did have ways of preserving meat. They did have ways of preserving apples and things like that. Things could be pickled. They could be packed in salt. They could be packed in brine. Um, but the food that you're throwing into your pottage changes a little bit by little bit by little bit throughout the year. So the pottage you have from your garden in February doesn't look like the pottage you have from your garden come October. So different foods are available at different times. And so you do have that variety. In the spring, you need a calf to be slaughtered in order to make cheese. Rennet is necessary for the making of cheese, or most cheeses made with an animal rennet. Obviously, we have vegetable rennets and the like these days, and you could make simple cheeses by just adding acids and milk. But in order to make rennet, you needed the stomach of a baby ruminant. You needed the fourth stomach that before they started eating grass. So while they're still drinking their mother's milk, you need that stomach. So that lamb or that calf would have to be slaughtered. And then in the spring, you would have this fresh lamb and these fresh, calf meat and things of that nature. And then if you had an animal near the end of its life, you tended to slaughter them before winter set in. Because if you've got a ox that you cannot put to work next year, you're not going to pay to feed that ox over the winter. If you have a chicken that's no longer laying, you're not going to pay to keep that chicken alive over the winter. Animals still needed to be fed. That needed to come from the farm. That needed to come from somewhere. And if you're going to eat it anyways, doesn't make economic sense. There was also a whole lot of religious restrictions. Now, obviously, we're talking about several hundred years of history, and we're talking about several different countries. So these laws weren't the same through the entire period. But for much of the medieval period in Western Europe, no meat was allowed on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. And again, this is from the church, the Catholic Church. There were different dietary laws for different religions. So no meat Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. During Lent and Advent, you also couldn't have meat, dairy, and eggs. You've heard about like Pancake Fat Tuesday or something like that. I know I have, and I'm not. I do not practice Lent, but I still heard of it, and that's just kind of getting rid of the last of your dairy and eggs, kind of before you go into Lent, which is definitely interesting. And there are recipes for it then, and people still do it now. But when you're looking at Lent, you're looking at Advent, and you're looking at Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. That's almost half the year. Half the year you could not eat meat. And that includes no meat broth. If it's a no meat day, you can't put meat in your pottage and just pick it out and eat it. Or pick it out and eat the pottage and not the meat. And people were very serious about these dietary laws. Now, obviously, if you're starving to death, you're going to eat what you can get your hands on. I mean, that's true then, that's true now. But not following these dietary laws could lead to fines, imprisonment, or basically your eternal soul could be in jeopardy. You could go to the church courts if you're found to be breaking these restrictions, and you can get into real legal trouble. So obviously, kind of a drag not eating meat, right? You can have fish, and you can have other things, but I mean, if you're rich, meat's delicious, and that's a status symbol. So people found ways around this. During certain points of time, there was the belief, and I don't know how they actually believed this, but people claimed to believe that a beaver tail, which there is a European type of beaver, well, they're in the water, so beaver tail must be fish since they're always in the water. So that means I can eat beaver tail. And you can just kind of skirt that line. You're just kind of walking that line. There's a story of the Barnacle Goose where it was believed that these geese hatched from barnacles that grew along the water. And because it hatched from a barnacle, it was a type of fruit, or it was a fish, and it was fair game on fast days. Obviously, many people refuted this. Obviously, a goose is not a fish. A goose is not a fruit. And people clearly knew this, but just wanted that delicious goose flesh. And in fact, one of the popes, Innocent III, decreed that barnacle geese were not to be eaten during Lent in 1215. He didn't quite come up to the line saying it was meat, but he said it looked like a duck, therefore it's not suitable for Lent. I love the story of the Barnacle Goose. So we get into legal factors. So a lot of bodies of water, especially in England, were owned by the church, the gentry, and the nobility. Same thing in a lot of continental Europe as well. Forests were also owned by the church, the gentry, or nobility. So you couldn't just go out and fish anywhere you wanted. You couldn't go out and hunt everywhere you wanted. You couldn't go out and gather firewood anywhere you wanted. You had to pay for the right to do so. It could be part of your lease or part of your rent, where you said you can gather this amount, or you could hunt on these days, or you can fish on these days, or you could, you would have to buy the right to use it. And you would get into real legal trouble if you didn't. Everyone, I think, has heard of poaching. Poaching was serious business. If you were caught poaching during different times in history, you could be imprisoned, you can be fined, or you can be killed. So the average person, even though they're surrounded by wildlife, was not able to just go out and kill and eat an animal. So therefore, it helped make meat expensive. And that's part of the reason why the nobility also bought up all the fresh fish, because they owned the waterways and they drove up the price of what was available, causing the poor to mostly be able to have salt fish or eel. There was also sumptuary laws that controlled how much the rich could eat and feast. And when we say sumptuary laws, this is mostly about the rich. For poor, you're in a cottage, you've got a loaf of bread and you've got some pottage. You really can't afford to have a feast. So it doesn't really apply. But there was this really interesting uptick in sumptuary laws around food during the Reformation. And there's this great divide on how Catholic countries have their laws and how Protestant countries have their laws. In general, a Catholic country outlawed the consumption of certain animals, whereas the Protestant countries limited the amount of food which could be consumed. So they define gluttony in different ways. Here's a couple of examples of this. And obviously these sumptuary laws have been lifted. I mean, it's obviously wasn't illegal to eat beef and lamb through all of history in France, and certainly not now. But in France, which was Catholic, during a certain point, they outlawed eating beef and lamb. It was a rich, decadent food, and therefore, if you ate it, you were guilty of gluttony. In Milan, which was also Catholic, they banned roe deer, peacocks, and pheasants, some exotic kind of foods. Just like in Venice, exotic wild animals, exotic birds, they were banned from the diet. But whereas in England, after the Reformation, you could eat whatever exotic fowl you wanted. If you wanted to eat a peacock, that's allowed. But you could only have one dish of peacock. You couldn't have 5, because too many dishes of that bird, that's gluttonous. And also, what you could eat or the number of dishes was defined by your rank. In these countries and these Protestant countries. And an example is from Calvinist era Scotland. So if you're at the top of society, an earl or a bishop, you're allowed 8 meat dishes. So that 8 meat dishes is also alongside other non-meat dishes. If you were the...
Is that per meal?
Yes, per meal. This is at a feast. If you were the abbot, lord prior, or a dean, you would have 6. A baron or a freeholder was allowed to have 4. And if you're a burgher, which is basically a wealthy middle class city dweller, you could have 3 dishes, and they could all be meat. And there's very similar laws in other Protestant countries where, as you go up in society, you're allowed to have more dishes. So obviously, if you're super poor, you can't afford 3 dishes even if you wanted it. So it's kind of a moot point for you.
What if you're an abbot having at a feast with the archbishop? The archbishop gets more meat dishes than you?
So from my understanding of how this is interpreted, it's the person who holds the feast, holds the banquet. And also at a feast, at a medieval feast, people of a higher social status were served more as well. The food would come to the head table, and for instance, let's just use the king, and he would sample dishes and he'd send those out to his favorite people. So I believe it's a little bit of both. There would be 8 meat dishes allowed at this feast by law, but if you were a relatively unimportant guest, that may not make it down past the salt line.
Ah, right.
Which above the salt and below the salt is a very fascinating thing as well. Of course, I can't go into everything I want because otherwise this class would be all day. Um, you've also got foods that are simply not available in medieval Europe. And here's just a couple of examples. Again, some of these foods are available as you get closer to the end of the 16th century and at the top of society. There is evidence of potatoes and tomatoes at the end of the 16th century. But again, your average person isn't going to have access to them. So, if you choose to hold a feast and you choose to limit it to old world foods, which no one says you have to, um, these are some of the foods you should avoid. Um, Anything with capsaicin, unfortunately, is out. Yams and other kind of potato things are out. Iceberg lettuce, which of course lettuce is fine, but that particular type of lettuce. But let's be honest, there's way more yummy lettuce than iceberg. Um, Tea and coffee sometimes takes people by surprise because yes, there is tea in medieval Asia. Yes, there is coffee in medieval Middle East. And yes, Europeans did get exposed to these foods, especially on crusade. They just didn't become popular in Europe until post-period. It was just weird, dirty bean water or weird, dirty leaf water. Now, there were teas made, but when I say tea, I mean the tea leaf. Yes, there was ginger tea, there were tisanes and stuff like that, but this is specifically the tea leaf. Chocolate, unfortunately, is not a old world food. And in fact, the chocolate that was consumed in South America during this time bears little resemblance to what you can get in a Hershey bar. It's actually hot and spicy, but still delicious. Green beans, and by green beans, I mean our like standard American green beans. Yes, there are recipes, even recipes in old Roman cookbooks and Apicius that call for green beans. That's a fava bean. It's a very general term. But these green beans are our standard, sugar snap green beans and the things you find in the can at your local supermarket. Tomatoes, which are a nightshade. Bananas, unfortunately. Standard corn. So, interesting thing about corn is yes, there's absolutely so many different allusions to the word corn. They talk about corn. They talk about the corn queen. They talk about their corn harvest going back to antiquity. Corn meant grain. So your corn harvest could be wheat, it could be barley, it could be anything. So when the European settlers got to the New World and they saw maize, they said, hey, look, corn. That is what I mean by standard corn. Peanuts, pineapple, allspice, surprisingly, is when I was a kid, I thought allspice was just a spice mixture of all the spices. It's not. It's a specific berry. But allspice is New World, as is vanilla, cranberries. Shortening is not food. Shortening is chemistry. Rhubarb and turkey. Obviously, these are not the only ones, but these are some of the more common things in the current Western diet. So that big old turkey leg you eat at the Ren Fair, not so much. Besides, it's usually pretty dry anyways. Just skip it and go for the kebab. So now we move on to the way science shaped the way people think thought innate. So we do have to start with Hippocrates, who's hailed as the father of modern medicine. We've all heard his name, Hippocratic Oath. He concluded that health was influenced by four humors or body fluids that ran from cold to hot and moist to dry. And then a man named Galen came and built upon that foundation. And his ideas, the Galenic teachings, were in full force throughout the Renaissance and Middle Ages. Now, we're talking thousands of, a 1,000 year of history here. So obviously it did wax and wane in popularity. But he was the personal physician to one of the Roman emperors. He was considered an authority. And a lot of things that are attributed to Galen today are really thought to have been things that his students came up with as well. So the whole thing is just Galenic teachings. And for the rest of this, until otherwise, everything I'm talking about is a Galenic teaching. So a humor is a body fluid that regulates all essential aspects of the body, including health, temperament, and appearance. Most people were out of balance. The perfect human was completely imbalanced, but there were no perfect humans, except for just the one, right? So our first humor is blood, or sanguine. There are so many different things that they would link with these humors. There would be like a planet, and there would be a time of year, and there would be a direction. So I've just picked out a couple. It's associated with adolescence, spring, and the direction east. I found these lovely woodcuts, and they have one for each of the humors. And this is these late German woodcuts is a man embracing a woman. So someone with an excess of blood is thought to have a sanguine or a cheerful temperament. They're boisterous, they're bubbly, they're chatty, they're openly emotional, social extroverts. Also, if you're ruddy, with a red face, you're thought to be sanguine because you have so much blood. I would be considered sanguine. I personally think it's rosacea, but why not? It's a lot of blood in my face. And blood is the most abundant fluid that's found in the human body. If you want to increase your blood, you want hot, moist foods such as onions and long pepper, which long pepper is delicious if you've never had long pepper. Quail in summer as opposed to quail in winter, which is the opposite. And some meats such as veal, chicken, and lamb. If you want to decrease blood, now, we all know how they decreased blood back in the day. We're just talking about food, though. You eat cold, dry things such as mushrooms, oranges, which is interesting. Oranges is dry, but it puckers the mouth and causes you to go dry. It's not, even though it has liquid in it. And things such as goat and quail in winter. Phlegm, which is cold and moist. People that have an excess of phlegm are thought to be phlegmatic or languid. They're meek, submissive introverts who live to please others. Obviously, these are definitions from the day. It's not nice to call someone a submissive these days, but that was the definitions we're working with. We have a couple at leisure from our wonderful late period woodcuts. Phlegmatics were pale. Their waters, they had a kind of washed out color. There was a quarter as much phlegm as there was as blood. So we've got so much blood and only a quarter as much of phlegm. If you want to increase your phlegm, if you have too little phlegm, you want to eat cold, moist foods such as apples, spinach, melons, and egg whites. If you want to decrease your phlegm, you want hot, dry foods such as garlic, my personal favorite, honey, hare, goat, and peacock. And that should say wild mustard. I point that out every time. I've always forgotten to change it after the class. Oh, and phlegm is associated with maturity, autumn, and the direction north. Then there's yellow bile or cholera. That is hot and dry. People that have a choleric temperament are quick tempered and angry. They're proud, extroverted, angry people who like to dominate others. We have a man beating a woman from our woodcut. Cholerics are yellow tinged. Um, Jaundiced is what we'd call it today. And there is 1/16 as much cholera or yellow bile as there is blood. They're associated with childhood, summer, and the direction south. 2, increased cholera. You want hot, dry foods like the garlic and the salt and the goat. If you want to decrease it, you're going to want to eat cold, wet food, such as apples, cherries, and pork. And again, even if you eat pork hot, it's still a cold food. We'll go into that in a minute. Black bile or melancholy is cold and dry. And people with an excess of black bile were thought to have a melancholic or sad temperament. They're emotionally sensitive introverts that are also perfectionists. And they have dark, sunken eyes. And there's an old man resting from our woodcut. Black bile is in tiny, tiny amounts. There's only 1/64th as much black bile as there is blood. And it's associated with old age, winter, and the direction west. To increase melancholy or to make your body more cold and dry, you want things like mushrooms and lentils and beef. And if you want to decrease it, have very wet, hot things like onions and turnips. So, great information. What do we do with it? So, there was the belief that food could be used to treat illness. Food as treatment, food as health. So, what you ate could alter your health and humors. So, if you were lacking in any one of these humors, you would be prescribed to eat more of the other humors. And they believe that you could balance yourself, among other ways of doing it, by altering your diet. There are many, many herbals at the time that published classifications of food. If you go to Good Cookery website, there is a section that I'm going to pronounce this very badly, but the Tactamen Titanius or something like that. And they go through food and they show you the little illustration, and it says what its humoral makeup is and what food it's good for. It's good for this, but it's bad for this. It's really fascinating. And there were many, many available throughout the years, and some of them agreed and some of them didn't. So in one herbal, it may say that this food is hot in the 3rd degree, but the next one may say it's hot in the 2nd degree. You know, it's kind of guesswork, not a perfect science. But the humoral makeup of food was determined by a couple different things. Partially, it's what the food does to the body, not just the physical characteristic. For instance, verjuice, which is an acidic, like, let's just say vinegar, which verjuice isn't vinegar. I don't want you to think that. But vinegar is wet. It is physically a liquid, but it's considered dry because of what it does to your body. It puckers your mouth, it dries you out. A lot of food could be considered cold because in order for your body to digest it, it cools you down, even if you eat it hot. The color and the taste and how much body waste you produce could help define its effect. Often the flesh of the meat contain the humors that match the behavior of the animal. Really interesting thing about pork. Pig's flesh is considered the closest to human. And if you're ill, it's better to consume pork because your body needs building blocks that it can easily convert to human or to whatever it is your body needs to fix you. was also believed that the pig's body was very similar to ours in its makeup. Um, and I mean, today, unfortunately, they still, I mean, we've many people, or in many areas of the country, they do allude to long pig, which is people, but obviously we don't eat people because that is horrific. Um, Galactic teachings also established degrees of intensity. So things went from 1 to 4 on how cold or hot or dry or wet they were. And they could have different degrees of moisture and heat. Here is, oh, not quite yet. Here's a chart that um, I did not make this chart. It is from the book Health and Healing in the Medieval Garden, and specifically from an article written by Terence Scully, which is a cook's use of therapeutic garden herbs. It may be fairly small in whatever you're looking at it, but if you go to my website, there is a larger copy of this. And it just does show kind of where things are according to Terence Scully, which he pulled from different herbals. So again, I absolutely am not claiming this chart for myself. I did not make it. But you see, things like onion are moist in the 4th degree and hot in the 4th degree. So it's as moist and as hot as you can get it. But things like long pepper is moist in the 2nd degree, but it's hot in the 3rd. So it's a little bit, it was very, very different in how it could be graded. So
it is now 21 after the hour.
Yep, we are almost done.
Okay, and it's really up to the room whether they want to
Yeah.
continue because it is their lunch hour.
Yep. I literally have one more slide.
Go.
Okay. So I'm just going back. So to continue food as treatment, they believed that the stomach was a cauldron, and your body needed to produce heat to cook the food you ate. So if you were of a really high social class and you had a lot of money and you had a lot of workers and you didn't do any physical labor, your food would be baked, or your food would be roasted and then boiled and then fried, or probably boiled before roasted, because otherwise what's the point? But it would be highly refined because your body doesn't produce enough heat to burn up that hard rustic food that's, let's just say, roasted on a fireside. Versus if you're a farmer, if you worked the fields, if you were a shipbuilder, you toiled and you worked hard, if you were given some highly refined food, your body would burn it up immediately and it wouldn't nourish you. That's not that different from what we believe today. If I'm going to eat a giant, really rich meal and then lay around and do nothing, I might get indigestion. Versus if I just have a bag of chips before I leave for the day and spend my day walking around golf wars, I would be starving and hangry because I didn't give myself enough nutrition. So the idea that the stomach is a cauldron isn't quite, it's not quite right. It's not quite wrong. I mean, there are stomach acids. But they thought that foods had to be highly different based on your social class. If you gave the rich white bread, their bodies produced it just fine. But if you gave the poor white bread, it didn't give them enough nutrition to get through the day. And if you gave the rich good, rough, honest brown bread, it would just rot in their stomach because they didn't do enough work to burn it off. And I also believe that hot spices, things like ginger and stuff, when we're up here hot, would close the stomach, and it would let you, it would aid in digestion. And that's it. And then I have just a lot of sources because I'm a giant nerdling.
There are no questions, but some interesting comments in the chat. So people might want to check that before they leave. but none of them specifically for the instructor. Other than thank yous.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you. This has been very interesting and very informative.
Yeah, I find it a really fascinating kind of thing to talk about because, again, if you know where to start from, you can really build a foundation that is more than just, hey, this is what they ate, but hey, they could have eaten this because of these reasons.
And who they are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the last bit about the poor can't digest all this wonderful stuff that we eat. It's a real good reason to say they can't have the good stuff.
Well, even if they could afford it, it would just be bad for their bodies anyways.
Exactly.
But really, if you think about it, it does make a certain kind of sense.
It does, yeah. Interesting. This has given me more rabbit holes.
Oh yeah, there's definitely a lot of rabbit holes.
Okay,
It just
folks.
goes to show institutionalized classism didn't begin with us.
No,
I'm
not
going
at
to
all.
stop the recording at this.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye. Thank you.